So our first speaker today is Taka Sarui with BKSK. Do you want to consider stand?
Oh, I guess I'll stand. Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Taka Sarui. It's more of an introduction than maybe a presentation, but I'm an architect working in New York City at BKSK Architects. I'm also a co-founder of a multidisciplinary collaborative called XLXS, and I'm also an educator. I've taught at the New School and Pratt Undergraduate School of Architecture, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I think it's great that we're talking about code in New York City because it's something from my professional experience that I have to deal with on a daily basis that we never really get to talk about outside of the office. You know, I think one of the most common things that I hear in the office is that to code? You know, can you build that to code? And it's this question that makes code sound like this big brother that's, you know, kind of oppressing this creative design that we're trying to flesh out. But I think it's also a very important factor for, you know, equality and safety and providing an environment that is a good environment within not just New York City, but everywhere else. I don't know, I guess from an educator's point of view, I've talked a little bit about how much code do we teach in New York City in schools as an educator, and I think an answer to that, the quick answer to that is we don't teach it at all. It's just something that, you know, if you actually gave somebody gigantic folders of code to read and analyze, they would get bored and quit architecture school. But it's also just, I think my longer answer to that would be there's always students in school. I just finished teaching like a first year undergraduate course at Pratt, and there's always that overambitious student who's like, you know, is that ramp, is the slope of that ramp gonna be okay? Like, do the stair treads have to be this dimension? And of course the answer to that is like, don't worry about that. Like, you're designing, like you're in design school, and it's not something you should be thinking about at this point. But at the same time, if you think about code, it's also about, you know, the human environment and the body and how our bodies kind of fit into all these environments that we're creating. So I think when you brought up the word curiosity, that's a really good word to think about in terms of code, because code is kind of our reflection of curiosity and criticism of, you know, socially and culturally what kind of environment we can and want to live in. So that's a kind of precisely what we should be teaching students in design environments as well. So that would be my long-ended answer to how is code taught in school. And then lastly, I'm Japanese, so I'm hoping for the panel discussion I can kind of bring to the table how code, even though on the outset feels like it's just about equality and safety, but it is also this very deep cultural thing that we deal with every day. You know, like, I'm very biased. I love Japanese design because I'm Japanese. But one of the things I always said to myself before I knew much about code is like, why is it that in America, like the railings, there's so many, you know, spindles on a railing? Like, I don't get it. Whereas in Japan, you have this beautiful thin railings that, you know, like a 4-year-old kid can fall off of and die to their death. And the reason for that is actually, I mean, yes, design preference, but also the reason for that is it's code. It's rules and guidelines that are in place and either is or not being followed. So I think it's good to keep in mind that code is this thing that's different in terms of geography and culture. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
So next up we have David Breen with the New York City Department of Transportation, providing the insider view.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Breen. I'm an urban designer. I work in the public space unit at New York City DOT. This isn't really a presentation, so apologies. It's more just a selection of slides that I picked up in the office, but they all speak about regulation in some form. So I thought that they might all be some of some interest to today's discussion. Regulation in terms of sort of how spaces are managed, how they're organized, how they're implemented, and then a bit of information about the programs that we manage in the public space unit at DOT, and how they sort of vary in terms of regulation and control. But starting just with a kind of a nice quote from E.B. White, which if you flick to the next slide, maybe he had a point. This is this. Like I said, I just found this yesterday, and it's maybe the best, most ridiculous PowerPoint slide I've ever seen in my life. So this is a typical street, could be anywhere in the city, and it points out every single agency, every single city government entity that has some level of control in how our spaces are formed and how our streets in particular are regulated. So when you think about that quote, it's a wonder that we ever get anything done. Really, it's amazing. This is another really, it might be a bit dark, unfortunately, but this is another really great slide that we refer to a lot, just sort of as a side-by-side comparison, just looking at sort of how the city is made up in terms of its land use, in terms of its space. This could be terrifying when you think about it in the context of the previous slide, especially when you think of 27% of the city's land use is street, so 27% is all applicable, all governed by the madness on that previous slide. But it's also a tremendous opportunity. 27% of streets in this city works out, 27% of land use in this city works out to about 6,000 miles of street and 12,000 miles of sidewalk, which, from our perspective in the public space unit, is just all potential space that's up for grabs, all potential space that could be reconfigured or reimagined in different ways, and that really sort of sets the tone for the work that we do in the public space unit. So the next few slides just sort of give some example of some of the work that we do, some of the programs that we manage in our unit, and these all ramp up with regulation as you go through them, as they increase in complexity, as does the amount of regulation that's sort of installed upon them. So the first of the programs is you can actually flick back if that's okay. So I don't know where I'm looking, but this first image is from our Weekend Walks program, which some of you may be familiar with. There's a common theme throughout all of the programs that we manage, and that's that they're all application based. We, the city, we DOT, we don't initiate any of the work that we do within the public space unit, at least. It's all brought to us through an application process or just by requests made by whether it be a not-for-profit group or a bid or just a regular resident from anywhere in the city. So they all have a sort of a grassroots, sort of bottom-up approach to them, which speaks a lot about sort of, in terms of regulation, it speaks a lot about sort of what you can manage and how that has to escalate as you progress. So this is the first program. This is Weekend Walks. This photo, I believe, this is in Williamsburg. I think this is Bedford Avenue. This is, like I said, it's application based, and it's focused along commercial corridors that we close to traffic for a day or a series of days through the summer season, and we let people program them. We let people use them free from traffic, so it's really an opportunity to sort of take a breath and take in a perspective of the street that you don't normally get. Next slide. Thanks. I see you now. Thanks. This is the City Bench program. The City Bench you may have seen throughout the city. This is, like I said, application based, and whilst it might be seen as a bench, pretty standard, pretty regular. From our perspective at DOT, there's very much a qualitative component to this. Very much a sort of a qualitative sort of, I couldn't call it a regulation, but it's quality focused in the sense that our intention isn't just to litter the street with benches. Our intention is to find nice places to sit and put a bench there so people can take in the street and can take a break, take a breath. Next one, thanks. This is the Street Seat program, which some of you may have seen on Essex Street, just around the corner from here. This is taking regulation and sort of using it for something that it was perhaps not originally intended for. What we do is we take a parking space out of the street. We use a typical curb regulation to prevent people from parking there, and then we through applications we encourage people to build this structure and take a seat in the street, using a space that you wouldn't normally be open for people to use. Next one. And then the Plaza program is the largest of the programs that we manage in the public space unit, and those typically happen in one of three ways. The first is a one-day Plaza program, a one-day Plaza event, which, similar to the Weekend Walks program, is very low tech, very low on regulation, very low on control, which, like I said, we see as a positive. It's really sort of open to our partners to program the street as they wish, to use it as they wish, to really showcase what the potential the street may have if it were to become a more permanent public space. Next one is what we consider an interim materials plaza. So this is when we close a street permanently, but we do so using temporary materials. So it's again a very, very light touch, but it has a really significant impact in terms of sort of transforming the street, transforming the city that we live in. And then next one is permanent reconstruction. So this is when we actually sort of start to engage all of the units that you saw, all of the agencies that you saw on the first slide or the second slide. But the outcome is obviously very, very different, and that's really our intention. This is subjected to the same level of regulation as any typical street, but it's used in a much different way, and what we hope is a much more positive way. And then I just wanted to end just on this. It's not possible to talk about regulation in public space right now in the city without making some reference to Times Square. That might be something that comes up later on in the panel. So happy to talk about that in a bit more detail. But yeah, I figured this would be a fitting way to end. So thanks.
Very apropos, our next presenter is a desnuda, actually. Just kidding. Our next presenter is Karen Kuby, an architectural and housing consultant and a visiting associate professor at Pratt.
Great, thank you so much. I'm a super fan of Van Allen and super happy to be at this program. Next slide, please. Oh, well, okay, this says design assignment, show what we can have if we break the rules. Next. I'm going to present 3 projects very quickly. I have 3 different roles. In the first, I was a designer. In the second, I was curator and producer. And for the third, I'm simply a fan. Next, please. Making Room is a project of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, which is a housing advocacy group, and the Architectural League, which is an architecture nonprofit that's been around for 100 plus years. Next. And the starting point is an important study done by Citizens Housing and Planning Council, which looks at the mismatch between our housing laws and the housing stock they produce, and our demographics, so the way we actually live. Next. Importantly, our housing laws, over 100 plus years, are mostly geared toward nuclear families. The word family actually appears in the laws a lot. But if you look at the real demographics of New York right now, those households are only 17%. We have a lot of people living alone, a lot of people living in shares of different types. Next. So Citizens Housing Planning Council and Architecture League invited designer teams, including my own, to break these rules on purpose. Our job was to provide visions of what we could have if we loosened some of these regulations. Next. So I'll quickly go through some of my colleagues' works. These were exhibited at the Museum of City of New York. Deborah Gans, next. So we were collectively looking at a series of different issues. So Deborah Gans was looking in Queens at accessory dwelling units. Her starting point was, what are people doing already, a lot of it illegal, and how can we use that to create more livable designs? Next. Stanell and Rafi Siegel, next, looking at what if we take over office space and make it into housing, which we need a lot of. Next. And Peter Gluck, Terry Chow, and team next, looking at what could micro units look like. These would have been illegal, but how can we make small spaces that are quite livable? Next. Our team, with this great group of people, including Jonathan Kirschenfeld, produced a scheme called City as Living Room. Next. Where we started precisely by looking at code. So we started precisely by looking at two types of housing code, one for, quote, normal, use group 2 was sort of normal construction, use group 3 is for supportive housing, and you can see supportive housing means housing for formerly homeless, etc., usually with social services on site. And the requirements are easier, you don't have to have parking, etc. Next. What that means practically is that if you have a funny site, oftentimes normal construction is not viable, it just doesn't work, but you can build supportive housing. Next. So our proposal was, let's take the codes that exist for supportive housing and make them available to everyone. Our site that we chose was a Grand Concourse in the Bronx. Next. We produced 3 schemes showing different kinds of housing that could exist if we loosened regulations. Next. The first, SRO Redux. Next. It reinvents the SRO, or single room occupancy, switching up what's shared and what's private. Next. 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 The Flux, next, looks at how could we use large-scale apartments differently to accommodate different types of shares. Next. So this evolves over time for changing living patterns. Next. Here it is in a model. Next, and the last is the mix, next, that brings those all together. Next. So these are some shots of this exhibit in the Museum of City, New York. I think this was like the most exhibited show ever, so a lot of people and the public got to understand some of these code issues. Next. Next. And one thing that came out of this, next, is that was the RFP. This is the building, My Micro, now I think called Carmel Place, and you might have just seen in the Times. This is a micro unit building where the city waived some regulations to allow a building full of only micro units that would normally have been legal. And there's just a thing in the Times this week looking at one of those apartments. Next. The next project, Total Reset. Next. So my role in this was producer and curator when I was the executive director of a nonprofit called the Institute for Public Architecture, which looks at how architecture can better serve the public, primarily through a residency program. Next. Oh, there was one before. Yeah, okay, so this started because this was right when de Blasio came in and he declared a total reset for public and below market housing. Next. So we began with a roundtable saying, what are the issues that designers need to engage with? Next. Next. And then had this fellowship, a residency program. Next. And this was not an exhibition in a fancy museum. This was in the space of affordable housing before it was occupied up in Sugar Hill, a building by David Adjaye. Next. And we were super happy to collaborate with No Longer Empty, and I'm so happy Naomi is here. She was like such a dream to work with, seriously. So our next, our program was part of this larger exhibition that took over 2 floors of this building before residents moved in. These are our 4 fellowship teams. You'll recognize, I'll talk about the people on the top left. You'll also see Nadine Mallet, Killian Riano, and a team led by Kaya Kuhl. Next. So our exhibition took over a studio apartment before anyone moved in. Next. So this is a little bit of the exhibition. Next. No Longer Empty put on these amazing parties that meant that a lot of different people who don't look at architecture were seeing our exhibition. Next. Next. And we had a series of precise events, workshops that were about bringing in city officials, community leaders, architects, etc., to workshop our fellows' proposals with them and help them develop them. Next. 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 I'm going to talk about one project called 9x18, and Nathan Rich, who's part of the team, is here. Nathan Rich, Miriam Peterson, and Siggy Golan were our fellows who produced this project. Next. So 9x18 is named for the size of a parking space. These guys took what should be the most boring thing in the world and made it awesome. So this is where they taped out a 9x18 space so that people could actually understand, well, what does that really feel like? Next. And it feels like almost a studio apartment. That's what it feels like. They did a lot of amazing work. Next, data analysis, interviews, etc. And I think, to me, the most important things were, one, they took this boring thing and made it accessible to a really wide public. Two, they took a really fine-grained approach. Their proposal said, we have these parking regulations that are too across the board. We need to be more specific and, in particular, reduce parking requirements in areas with higher transit, et cetera. And then another thing is we need to think about what our parking looks like. It doesn't need to be flat. It can be super, it can be interesting. And what that means is we develop better housing and better neighborhoods and a better city. So our friend Michael Kimmelman got excited about it, did an Above the Fold article. Next. And recently, as you know, the city has just passed this new zoning, and actually the parking requirements in this go beyond what 9x18 proposed, and there is a reduction in parking in transit areas. Next. So if you're interested, there's everything from that exhibition is collected on this Tumblr, totalreset.tumblr.com. Next. Okay, and then this one I just really love. I'm a fan, and it's not from here, and I think it's really fun. So this is called Don't Stare So Romantically by Dubravka Sekulic. Next. Research into extra-legal construction in Belgrade and former Yugoslavia. So these are these rooftop extensions that get produced as Yugoslavia is turning toward capitalism, and there's a lack of housing available. So the go-to strategy is to do these extensions on the roof without building permit. Next. And what happens is, this is needed because there's just, the construction industry is trying to deal with capitalism. They can't do it fast enough, so the informal is actually the only way that this is going to get done. So the way the government responds is by retroactively making these things legal, which means developers get excited. So then it used to be, people were building this housing because they needed it. Developers get excited, and then you see a ton of this kind of development, not only for reasons of needing housing, but also toward money. So I will end with a quote from Dubravka, who is so brilliant and lovely, and she told me I could present her stuff. Can architects become something more than stylists for real estate speculation? A new chair needs to be added to the table, namely that of an actor powerful enough to break the bond between state and capital and plead for the common good. In the space of extra legality, the new can be born in reclaiming the right to housing both as a society and as architects. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Our next speaker is Mariah Burke, and she's the founder of Pop Productions.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Mariah. Mariah, like a ray of sunshine. It's a tricky one. But Pop Productions is an event studio. We work with all sorts of different brands to craft experiences, campaigns, and partnerships to spark delight. So we'll work with Airbnb on community events, Kiva on different celebrations, Tribeca Film Festival, individuals, and a lot of times when people think of events, they think of balloons and flowers and all of those sort of fun, fluffy things. things, and that's definitely a piece of it, but it's also a huge operation. There's a lot of logistics involved with events, especially when you're working with the city, with permits, with codes, and so that's what I'm here to talk about a little bit. So next slide. First, before we go in, some of the permits was going to show the non-side of it. If you just want to ignore all the permits entirely, you can do flash mobs. And so one event that I did is called the Feast Conference, and we had a very well-organized, executed conference, and at the end we wanted to do a party on the High Line, and didn't really know how to do that in any easy way. So we just decided to do it, and it ended in a flash mob in Penn Station. And the next slide, you'll see the party on the High Line. So we had like 200 boom boxes, glow-in-the-dark jellyfish, like 400 people dancing on the High Line. So that's one of the loopholes if you want to ignore the codes. But next we'll talk about some of the codes related. So this is an event with Airbnb. Airbnb sponsored the New York Marathon, and last year I organized 5 events in all of the boroughs. So we went to each borough, we did a community service project, we did a run in the park, and a party at a local business. And so that involved making permits for every single park of the area where we were going to be in, the run, the community service project. So this is a photo of our tent there, and then next is some other photos of our organized activities. Some other events that I have done is with Kiva. We did an event at the IAC building, which is that beautiful Frank Gehry building next to the High Line. They have a lobby downstairs, which is not technically a event venue. So you have to get a TPA, which is a temporary public assembly permit, which involves going with an architect, making an official floor plan. Oh, that did not work out exactly how planned, but a TPA basically is if you bring people together, over 75 people indoors and not an official event venue, you have to go through these steps a certain amount of days in advance through an architect official floor plan. It gets submitted to the commissioner office who has to approve. The fire marshal comes in, they do a walkthrough. Everything has to be exactly where it's laid in the floor plan. If it's not, you have to move it. And so that's sort of one of the hoops that I will jump through regularly in planning events. Other ones are the New York City Park Special Event Permit. Probably never knew this, but if you've ever gone to a birthday party in Central Park, technically if you have over 20 people gathering in a park, it is a special event and you're supposed to get a permit for it. So if you, next birthday party you're at in Central Park, if someone walks up to you and asks for your permit, now you know. Technically you're supposed to do it 21 to 30 days before. Most people don't do that, obviously, for private events, but if you were doing an organized company picnic or something like that, even if you don't want it to get ended prematurely, you could get a permit for it. Other permits I deal with are sound permits. So if you are doing something in the park or on a sidewalk, you also have to go through the New York Police Department and get a sound permit. Other permits are different insurance, liquor license, street activity permits if you're doing something on the sidewalk. I work with Tribeca Film Festival, and we'll set up step and repeats on the sidewalks outside of the movie theaters, and you have to get a permit for the tent, for the step and repeat. So there's lots of hoops to jump through, and excited to be here to answer any questions about it. And the next is just some of my information. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. And our final speaker before we launch into a panel discussion followed by a Q&A is Naomi Harrison-Riegskog, the co-founder of No Longer Empty.
Thank you. Next. So I'm actually going to present No Longer Empty because I think a lot of people actually might not be familiar with who we are. And also share with you that I'm coming from a cultural organizer, not as an urban planner or an architect. And so this 7 years since we were founded has been a learning experience and continues to be so. So for those that are not familiar, No Longer Empty is an art organization, and what we do is we take empty storefronts and empty buildings and we repurpose them into site-specific exhibitions. Next. Our main mission is about activating public engagement with contemporary art. And by staging these site-specific exhibitions that talk about the history of the neighborhood, the building, what it was or what it will be, we have a closer way of accessing a common ground with the public. So since 2009, we've done over 25 different projects in all boroughs except for Staten Island. And these slides we're going to show just an example of what we do. For example, in 2012, we took over the Clock Tower in Long Island City. Next. It was a bank that had been empty for 25 years, and that neighborhood was actually undergoing a lot of change. Next. And we created an exhibition called How Much Do I Owe You? The bank was a wonderful way of talking about value, currency, new forms of economy like time banking and time sharing. We also, next, activated it with panel discussions, next, artist performances, as well as children's activities. So it's very much looking at space in a holistic way and how can we build audiences in many creative aspects. So, and then, yeah. So I'm going to present 3 different points when we had to deal with codes. There are a lot more examples, but these I thought were the most salient ones. So the first one is Tower Records. This was back in 2010, winter of 2010. Next. Tower Records had been empty for 4 years, and we got permission from the property owner to come and stage an exhibition in our model. We did site-specific exhibition next that talked about the impact of technology on the music industry and distribution and getting recognized. And it was a wonderful participatory aspect. We have a stage in the back where emerging bands were able to stage a performance, or one of the artworks was all about flipping through albums and reading a poem. The opening night, we got thousands of people, and we had no idea that this was going to happen. We had no RSVP system. People were just so excited about this nostalgic place opening up again. And we had lines out the door. We weren't really prepared what to do. And actually, the police department, the local police department was alerted, and they came. And instead of shutting down, they just wanted to make sure that everything was okay, and then they left. And so that was our first encounter, and it wasn't like, here's a packet, next time you do this, and that. It seemed like everything was kosher. Okay, next project. Sugar Hill project in 2014. So next, we took over the 9th floor, as well as the 3rd floor and the ground floor. And this is a project that's very special. It's created by Broadway Housing Community. They are an affordable housing organization, and they had the audacious vision of building a home that had affordable housing, universal pre-K, and a future children's museum for art and storytelling. And we partnered together on this project because they saw No Longer Empty as an outreach tool for introducing themselves to the neighborhood, introducing what this building is going to serve, and building community around that, because we do a lot of educational and cultural programming. And this is significant because for us, as a young organization, this was the first time we were working with new construction rather than old buildings or old small storefronts. And the theme of that exhibition, If You Build It, talked a lot about home, belonging, building cities together. This is a project by 2 Irish artists that built a city out of sugar cubes. And people were able to come in and they build bridges, and many of the things fell down, but nonetheless, it was fun. Next. And also immigration. And I think this is a beautiful photo, not only because I love Sherazade Garcia's Catedral, the artwork, but also the juxtaposition of this is a new model of housing next to the public housing that's in the background. So there were a lot of issues with dealing with the new construction. This was 2014. If you remember that winter, we had major snowstorms that delayed the construction. That really impinged, next slide. That really impinged on our time frame, which is normal in the construction industry, but for an art organization, you have a lot of people that have a finite timeline to do a project like this, as well as collaborators. And one of the things that the Broadway Housing Community had to do, because they were the property owners, was obtain a temporary permit of occupancy. And with that, one of the requirements was that we all had to become fire guards, which was actually really fun. I encourage everybody to take the test. It's easy, and then you get a little card that you're a fire guard and you can go in anywhere and boss people around. Because this building did not have a sprinkler system that was ready. So we all my entire team, 6 people, became fire guards. We decked out the entire place with fire hoses. Nope, go back. But still what happened, and they got a little preview, but what happened was that the fire department came, and different from the Tower Records, they saw this beautiful artwork, which is by Radcliffe Bailey. It's 4,000 piano keys that are creating this undulating surface, and then you see a man in the middle. And it's not only referenced in Sugar Hill's musical history, it's also talking about the African-American experience of coming over the Atlantic. And they saw this and said, that has to go. And at this point, the elevators weren't working, and we had brought all those 4,000 up the stairs, 9 flights. And not only were we just shocked because this is a beautiful piece, but that means that we had to actually transport everything down through the stairways as well. And why did that happen? We still wonder a little bit, but it's because it was considered combustible materials. And this is something that we have encountered in other projects as well, the discrepancy of what is an art project, what's an art installation, versus what is a hazard. And it's usually much more of a reactive decision than sort of a cooperative experience. So what we had to do, next slide, we had to bring it all down. We put a little shrine in the middle there, and we had to substitute with another artwork, which was also equally, we took it from a different part of the exhibition and put it there. But nonetheless, this is sometimes what happens when you're working with government officials. And then the third project, the most ambitious one to date, next slide, is the old Bronx Borough Courthouse. This is in the South Bronx. This building, just incredible history, but briefly, it had been empty for 40 years and had been an eyesore in the community. Everybody was wondering what was happening. It had been decommissioned by Ed Koch and then sold at an auction by Giuliani, and a private property owner had been holding on to it for since then. And when we found it, next slide, it was completely looted. It was just a shell. Next slide. And there weren't the proper egresses and other sort of railings were not present. So we had to actually do sort of the same thing that we did in the Sugar Hill exhibition, which was, deck out our own fire safeties. In addition, get retrained as fire guards and so forth. Next slide. One of the things that we did, which was actually sort of impinging on our mission, is that when people had to come in, we had to ask them to sign a waiver, release of liability. It's debatable how effective these are in court if anything were to happen. I still don't know the full answer, but the reason that sort of was problematic for us is, as a public art organization, anybody coming in to read a letter, to sign their signature, it distances yourself from welcoming them into the art experience. Nonetheless, we did so. And the problem with this one is different from the Sugar Hill exhibition, that the DOB, it's divided by boroughs. The DOB and the fire department came and they enjoyed it, they had fun, they wanted to know what was going on, we were all chummy. There wasn't the same sort of regulation that the Manhattan Borough presented to us in 2014. So we had, next slide, we had a wonderful time, lots of people came, and next slide. I think that's about it. I'm sure there's a lot more that I can share about this experience, and there's a lot more that I'm going to learn, and I think I should enlist some of the architects in here. But it's been an adventure, and you learn by doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. In just a minute, we're going to engage in a discussion among the people who just spoke. Feel free to take a minute and grab a beer, and we'll start in just a few moments. All right. To begin with, to connect the first part of today, where we did an exploration of different public spaces in the Lower East Side and different interventions there. Among the different projects that were on display were an installation that you can see on the Norfolk Gate, the parking lot right there, that is a seating experiment of benches and chairs that collapse. They're plywood. They were designed by Bureau Karai Duman, and they were an invitation to occupy the sidewalk in a special way. And another one of the collaborators of this for this event was QSAP, and they put together a project called Coded Plumbing, which was looking at how we can better visualize the different codes that separate genders in public restrooms, which is very much part of the public debate right now across the country. This was an interesting way to spatialize that. And so if you were lucky enough to see that, what they did was they took the disused flower bed, which is right on Allen and Delancey. There's an abandoned 1930s public restroom there. That restroom actually used to serve the elevated train that used to run along Delancey up 2nd Avenue. And when that train track fell down, or came down, then the restroom was shuttered. And it's emblematic of issues in New York in terms of access to public restrooms in general. So I would love to ask the panel is, were those two projects of the sidewalk installation, the flower beds, and the visualization they posted on the abandoned restroom, is that legal?
I think, do I need a microphone?
No,
Okay.
you don't.
Unless you want to record it. Well, the first project, I think it's sort of similar to what No Longer Empty does, which is prototyping your public space. So by trying out and making street furniture and seeing how people are reacting, how they're using it, is anybody getting injured, how can we finesse the design, I think that's really informative, and somebody should be there probably welcoming them, but I think it is illegal, especially if you don't own the property at the sidewalk right there, right?
Yeah, from the perspective of the public rights of way from the sidewalk, it would be without the sort of due process followed. But there are, at DOT at least, there are several ways to legitimize that type of thing. The most boring and bureaucratic one would be to obtain a revocable consent permit from DOT, which essentially allows you to place a structure on the public right of way on the sidewalk, but then is obviously revocable at the city's will. But then there would be perhaps more akin to some of the examples that we've seen, some of the things that you spoke about that might make it more possible, a bit more interesting, a bit more fun. And for example, it could be considered art, right? And so, like what is art is obviously extremely subjective, which allows for a greater variety of interpretations, greater amount of possibilities. But then there is a legitimate sort of process to obtaining that. So that is a way of legitimizing more informal types of treatments, I guess.
David, I thought it was really interesting the way you enlightened us about how all these different public space interventions are application-based. And so that got me thinking about how can people know about that, and how can people in general broadly better understand codes and be informed about them so that they know to take advantage of opportunities like that.
To be fair, it's something that we've probably struggled with a bit in terms of sort of broadcasting the work that we do and making sure that it's available and accessible to as many parts of the city as possible. And it's something that we're grappling with, something that we're trying to work through. There's different ways of doing it. Obviously, there's some sort of old-fashioned ways about hosting events like this or attending events like this and speaking about the work that we do and focusing in areas that we consider priorities for areas that are lacking open space, areas that have been defined as low to moderate income, for example. Then there's also obviously more hip ways, through social media channels and so on. But it is something that we grapple with. It is something that we're working to rectify. It's something that we acknowledge we could definitely improve there. So what suggestion?
So with No Longer Empty, we have a lot of different peer organizations, and that has been really helpful in navigating some of these applications and permits. So for me, I know a few of the street permits just because my fellow practitioners are applying for it, and they have different ways of, well, you should speak to this person, or you have to do it like this. So that's how I think within the arts and culture, that's how it gets disseminated.
Yeah, and I think some of the codes that intersect with the projects I described are less like, oh, you, Joe Schmo, need to go and do this. It's more, how do you protect yourself as a tenant, for instance, against maybe a landlord who isn't keeping your building up to code. What do you do if, one thing that a lot of people don't know that was highlighted in the exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York is that it's illegal in New York City and state for more than 3 unrelated adults to live together. It's illegal for more than 3 unrelated adults to live together. Nobody knows that. And so sometimes it's fine. Sometimes it's 4 Vassar grads living in Williamsburg and it's fine. That's great. But sometimes it's not great. Sometimes it's vulnerable populations like immigrants in Queens and slumlords, and it's a fire hazard and people die. So I think, a lot of the information, a lot of good channels, I think, are tenants' rights organizations that are getting that out. I think the Center for Urban Pedagogy has done some really, really, really excellent work. As you probably know, a lot of people in this room, what they do is they'll pair a nonprofit advocacy group with a graphic designer to take a social issue and produce a pamphlet or other visual material that helps make that information accessible to a wider public. So they've done really important work looking at housing code issues, like one guide for what if you live in a basement, what do you do? So I think some of those issues are really good.
I mean, I think visualization is the first thing that comes to my mind, like the Center of Urban Pedagogy. I can't remember the name of it, but I think a lot of what people may or may not know is there's a lot of information that's becoming available digitally online now, and I think one of the ways you can learn about whether something is being done properly or not is to be able to question is this okay? Like when you have that question in your head, like this looks wrong, like how do I check? Like there's now all these resources online where you can look at the Department of Buildings or zoning to see like did these people file things correctly, so that like the empowerment of knowledge is much more available than it was maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's a great resource, whether it be tenant rights or whether like a ramp is built properly.
Maria, how do you usually find out about codes for specific events?
Yeah, a lot of it is online now too, which is great, and it's interesting talking, like in Tribeca Film Festival this year, I was applying for permits just through like NYC.gov.
You guys hear that Chris use the microphone?
Hello. I have a small squeaky voice, so microphone is good. A lot of it is done online through like nyc.gov, and the parks have a great website too, and you can actually apply for a lot of the permits through the internet, which is fabulous, and it shows you the progress, and you can apply, you can pay online too. And with Tribeca Film Festival last year and talking to people who had been doing it since the beginning, we're kind of joking how when they started they were like faxing in the applications or had to go bring the letter to the police department and things like that. So it's quite helpful nowadays as sort of the only way that I know, but is all kind of done through online applications and seeing kind of what's needed as well. And you can see the guidelines of if it's X amount of people, if a venue already has some of the permits in place, like a liquor license or something, or if you have to bring that in externally.
Taka, I was struck by what you said about comparing and contrasting code regulations in the US versus where you're from in Japan. Can you talk more about the differences with that? And I'd be curious what everyone thinks about, can codes adapt to the demographic or cultural specificities of a particular area?
Well, I don't know if everybody has been to Tokyo before, but in terms of the proximity of space and like if you go to Tokyo and you try to get into an elevator or a subway, whereas in Tokyo, like they would try to cram in, like they would literally, like the words "pack you like sardines" is like taken very literally when you go into an elevator or a subway, where like people don't mind, like touching each other or like being crammed, like a baby carriage. I went to Tokyo last year with a baby, and it's incredible how willing they are to push a baby carriage against a wall so that one extra person can fit into an elevator. So there are these cultural differences about like proximity and what people are comfortable with. Like, you know, if somebody's standing behind you in a line, like in America, there's like, you know, good 7-8 inches, but in, you know, in like other countries, like people get real close. And I think that's kind of some of the cultural differences that start as a safety concern of whether or not, you know, is 7 3/4 of an inch too tall for a tread, or can it get even higher? Like, can it be 10 inches? But like an example of one thing, the railing, I think, is a good example. And to be honest, I've never practiced that much in Tokyo, so I don't really know what the code actually are. But in America, in most spaces, you're required to have, you know, barriers so that something larger than 4 inches cannot fall off a landing or a stair. But if you look at a lot of stairs and railings in other countries, you'll notice that they completely ignore things like that. And I guess that could either be that that's a code regulation that's different, or it could just be that how much are they enforcing and caring about that code. And you know, if you actually ask somebody in Tokyo, like, isn't this dangerous? Like a lot of people will probably say, like, the kids learn not to fall off a stair landing. You know, it's so that it feels like there are concrete things to what safety is, but it's interesting how it differs based on how people think culturally about safety and proximity.
Did anyone else want to speak to that topic?
This is not as drastic, but I do events in California a lot too, and in London, and even just seeing some of the different regulations there of how strict different venues are in different cities is really interesting. Of like, in California, I did an event in Oakland at the museum, and that they were so lenient compared to museums in New York that I do, and it was sort of like, oh yeah, this is your plan that you made in like Photoshop, no worries, that's fine. So it's just sort of interesting in New York City. I think we probably deal with more regulations than other cities probably are.
Yeah, and maybe a note on the history of codes in New York. You know, Taka was talking about visualization. I mean, codes have existed a super long time because there were fires very early in Dutch settlement. So the first codes were about making sure buildings were built to prevent fires. And then another really important wave in housing, it's really important when Jacob Riis publishes How the Other Half Lives, and the larger public is seeing images of how immigrants are living in super crowded conditions on the Lower East Side. Oh, the Lower East Side. And in an era where, you know, tuberculosis is happening. So there's a design competition that's also important. These sorts of strategies from over 100 years ago, but what are strategies to get the design profession involved? And it's a publicity strategy, right? To then, because anytime you're doing one of these things, it's not just about somebody in government hanging out writing new policy, but also, you know, what are the public engagement strategies that are also going to change public opinion? Because these things happen in parallel, and that's when that happens. So there's a design competition, and the first sort of laws for tenements that require light and air in certain ways. So I think it's interesting to look historically at how those things have emerged in our city.
Really interesting, the example you gave. So was it Belgrade, where the government has retroactively gives permission for building extensions and so on? Because something that the UK government has just done, and I think it's specific to London, is that they have just reduced the regulation for single-family home extensions, where you'd previously have to obtain the relevant permits and permissions in order to add like a lean-to the side of your house. They've actually abandoned that now, and you can go ahead and do that without permission, and really in response to sort of the huge demand for housing in London specifically. But it's very interesting sort of how in terms of sort of how governments adapt and how regulation can be adapted or changed to accommodate demand, accommodate circumstances. It's just two different examples. It's interesting to note.
And just sort of, you know, tying those two comments, I think I think since 2009, all of us have seen a surge of pop-ups or people using alternative spaces. So sort of what the work of No Longer Empty and Shashama and other organizations, it's building a momentum for government to step in and say, okay, well, let's accommodate this phenomenon that's happening. It's sort of creating a demand. And maybe surprising to many people, when we find our spaces, it's essentially us cold calling, unless it's word of mouth or something like that. So can we bring more property owners to the table to do this that actually can benefit the community? And so I think sometimes it would be really good for government to be more responsive or proactive, but that means that we have to really show our desires and start demanding this collaboration.
This is part of our week-long festival looking at disruption and not just how are Uber and Airbnb and Seamless disrupting our daily lives, but how can everyday people disrupt the city. And so I'd like to ask each of you, what's a specific loophole or a gap in the code that everyday people can utilize to make the city more enthralling or equitable, exciting? How about you, policymaker?
Okay, thanks. I'm not a policymaker. Well, I think some of the examples that I showed in the few slides are sort of really great examples of that in terms of how people can reclaim the streets, reclaim what was spaces sort of that had been designated for traffic, for vehicles, and how they can be transferred to become spaces for people, really to accommodate and to provide space where it's much needed. This is a tremendously dense city that really lacks public open space. And so some of the work that we're doing, or the work that we're doing, is really specifically looking to readdress that balance, provide space that doesn't previously exist or hasn't previously existed, but by looking at what our portfolio is and sort of trying to understand sort of how it can be repurposed to provide that need.
I'm going to sort of answer this for my personal interest. I would love to see a lot more sound installations or temporary visual interventions. There's a lot of sound in New York City, but if something could grab us and stop us in our tracks, it would be interesting to see how that would play out to a certain space, if it's interviews that you're hearing from the 1920s or something like that. But also, at Columbia, I studied urban planning, and I actually looked at rooftops. And so that's another area that I think could be sort of hijacked, not only for green urban sustainability, but to really build community within your buildings or in your community. So that would be another disruptor.
So a lot of my work is less about everyday people working with these codes. I think the architectural profession is a super important mediator, and I started thinking about something like WebMD, right? Now we can all look up our ailments and get super freaked out, but maybe we should talk to a doctor who can help interpret that stuff for us. So my work is less about that. I think it's super interesting that DOT is actually working with its own loopholes, right? You have this infrastructure that was for cars, and then you're breaking your own rules to make it for people again. I think that's super interesting. And maybe people don't realize what?
People might not realize at DOT you might be,
right. And I think maybe a direct answer to your question, Stephen, is that a lot of this sort of informal extra-legal housing activity in New York can't practically be enforced. There are a lot of people living communally, and nothing's gonna happen to them. So you can probably go for it and be fine.
Unfortunately, when I think of code loopholes, I often think of what developers do to get away or build an extra bedroom, or build a room that's really a windowless room but ends up being a bedroom. But What's interesting about code is it's mostly text. When we study architecture or go to design school, it's all very often like visual diagrams, you know, dimensions, but it's very often text that you have to interpret. So it's very ambiguous. Like I think, for example, like sometimes they'll say like you can have planting here, but they won't specifically describe what planting is. And when you actually think about what planting is, it could be very many things. It could be, you know, like a 2-inch thick turf, or it could be, you know, something with a 2-foot deep soil. So you can kind of start using the ambiguity as, I suppose, loopholes, although I'm sure they'll hate that word if you think about it that way. But yeah, I would definitely say, I mean, I think, for example, like, is this a something that burns, or is this art? I think that's, in that ambiguity, there's a huge loophole. Like, is this a wall, or is this a railing, or is this a planting? If you can kind of start to stretch those words into what you want it to mean, I think therein lies your loopholes.
I think it's a very exciting time of events right now, as everyone is wanting these really unique experiences. People don't want to go to the same venues that they've already seen. People are looking for these like undercover, want to go to the abandoned warehouses, the unique spaces. And so that's sort of a loophole in itself, is this new discovery of spaces in the city. And there's so many new sites now that are popping up, like Splacer and Peerspace, that are sort of these Airbnb-esque for event venues where you can rent spaces by the hour or by the day to host your own events. And I guess sort of a loophole is, if you're not making it a public event, if they are private events, there's a lot less of the restrictions that you have to go to. So if you're inviting 75 of your friends and not like charging tickets and making an Eventbrite and things like that, there's a lot less of those sort of steps you have to take. So even if, like, I've rented Splacers out for birthday parties and things like that, and if you're not making it a really public official thing, then you don't need a liquor license, you don't need things like that. It's just sort of like your friends gathering in a space like your apartment, but this sort of extension of your apartment. So as far as I'm aware, that is a loophole. We'll see what happens if it gets broken up or anything.
We did an event with the organization Splacer last fall in an abandoned church that hadn't been used in a few years, and I wish I had known that I did not have to apply for a liquor license.
Well, if you sold tickets though, or if it was public, then you still needed to.
Good point.
It was not private.
Okay. I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists. One quick note about codes: you're not allowed to leave the room holding a beer. There are younger people outside the door. Also outside the door in the festival, in the parking lot, is a festival that's about to launch, Arte para mi gente, which is put on by the Clemente, and so there will be music down there that you can enjoy. You can also stay here, hang out with the panelists. And also, I hope to see you at other events this week that are part of our Spring Festival. Tomorrow at 4 p.m. at Van Allen on 30 West 22nd Street, there will be presentations of proposals by finalist teams that are envisioning alternatives for the impending L train shutdown. And so it'll be a great opportunity to see what's going to happen and what could happen, and to have your 2 cents. So thank you.